The Karath Empire didn't do anything halfway. When they built war academies, they built fortresses. When they trained warriors, they started with cubs who still had their baby teeth. And when they hired a human to maintain the environmental systems on Brontide 9, they apparently forgot to mention that the facility also housed 6 juvenile apex predators who could tear through reinforced steel when properly motivated. Holly had been on the job for 18 days, and nobody had bothered to tell her that her actual job description included babysitting. "Hux, we've talked about this," Holly said, standing in the middle of the dining hall with her hands on her hips. "You cannot, and I mean cannot, eat your dinner off the floor. We have plates for a reason." The cub in question, roughly the size of a motorcycle, covered in midnight black scales with bioluminescent markings that pulsed when he was annoyed, looked up at her with eyes that could have melted combat armor. His species had conquered half the known galaxy through sheer intimidation and tactical brilliance. His ancestors had brought empires to their knees. Holly was unimpressed. "Don't give me that look," she continued, retrieving the chunk of synth meat he'd knocked off his plate. "We're civilized beings here. That means using utensils, or at the very least, keeping food off the floor where Drell stepped in coolant earlier." Drell, lounging in the corner, made a sound that might have been laughter or might have been a warning growl. With the Karath, it was honestly hard to tell. The translator chip in Holly's ear rendered it as something between amusement and mild threat, which basically summed up every interaction she'd had since arriving. The dining hall was industrial, all metal surfaces and harsh lighting, designed for function rather than comfort. Typical military installation. Holly had added what she could: some hanging plants that probably violated a dozen safety protocols, a few posters with motivational quotes about teamwork, and placemats. Honest-to-God placemats with little diagrams showing where plates and cups should go. The Karath Empire's top generals would have had collective aneurysms if they'd known. "All right, everyone," Holly announced, moving to the preparation counter. "Dinner is served, and before anyone asks, yes, there will be dessert, but only if we all demonstrate appropriate mealtime behavior." Pix, the most energetic of the bunch, perked up immediately. Her scales were a deep crimson, and she had a habit of moving 3 times faster than necessary for any given situation. Define appropriate. Not throwing food, not wrestling during the meal, using indoor voices. Holly started distributing plates, each loaded with the carnivore-appropriate nutrition the cubs needed. "And absolutely no biting. We've been over this." "But biting is natural," Tor interjected. He was methodical, thoughtful, the one most likely to actually listen to instructions. "Our instructors say we should never suppress our predatory instincts." "Your instructors aren't here at dinner time, are they?" Holly shot back, raising an eyebrow. "And when they are here, do they let you bite them?" Tor considered this. "No." "Exactly. Because biting is for combat training and hunting, not for expressing frustration when someone takes the last of the good synth meat." She glanced pointedly at Hux, who had the decency to look slightly guilty. Lith, the smallest of the group, had already finished half his plate. He ate quickly, efficiently, like he was afraid someone would take it away. Holly had noticed that particular behavior on day 3 and had been working on it ever since. Food security issues, probably left over from whatever brutal selection process the Karath used to choose their warrior candidates. "Slow down, Leith," she said gently, placing a hand on his shoulder. His scales were cooler than human skin, textured like fine sandpaper. "There's plenty. No one's going to take your food." He paused, looked up at her, and something in those alien eyes seemed almost vulnerable. Then he deliberately took a smaller bite, chewing slowly. Holly smiled. There you go. Good job. Kef, watching this interaction with the calculating gaze of someone who missed nothing, tilted her head. You praise him for eating slower, but slower means more vulnerable to ambush during field operations. We're not in the field. We're at dinner. Holly moved back to the counter to grab the vegetables, flash frozen and reconstituted, but better than nothing. And you know what? Even warriors need to rest. Even predators need safe spaces. Safe spaces are for the weak, Drell recited, like he was quoting from a manual. Safe spaces are for the smart, Holly corrected, dumping a portion of greens onto each plate over a chorus of groans. Because smart warriors know that you can't fight effectively if you're exhausted, stressed, and malnourished. Your body needs more than just protein, hence vegetables. Vegetables are dishonorable prey, Hux muttered, poking at a piece of something green with one claw. Vegetables aren't prey at all. They're plants. They don't run. Holly sat down at the head of the table, her usual spot, though she'd had to bring in her own chair since all the furniture was sized for beings much larger than humans. And honor has nothing to do with nutrition. Eat your greens. The cubs exchanged glances, that peculiar silent communication that pack predators seem to manage without any visible signals. Holly had learned to recognize it. They were deciding, collectively, whether to push back or comply. Finally, Pix speared a vegetable with one claw and ate it with exaggerated disgust. This is terrible. This is healthy. There's a difference. Holly took a bite of her own meal. Standard human rations. Nothing exciting. Besides, you'll thank me when you're in the field and you're not dealing with the nutritional deficiency issues that, apparently, plague half the Kahrath military. How do you know about that? Tor asked, genuinely curious. I read the medical reports. They're not classified, just boring, so nobody looks at them. Holly shrugged. Turns out, when you feed warriors nothing but meat and combat stims, they develop some interesting health problems by age 20. Who knew? The truth was, Holly had stumbled into this position completely, by accident. She'd been hired as an environmental systems technician, someone to keep the air recyclers running, the water clean, the temperature regulated. Standard contractor work on a military installation. She'd expected to spend her days alone in maintenance tunnels, maybe interact with a few surly officers, collect her paycheck, and move on. Then she'd discovered the cubs. 6 juvenile Karath, somewhere between 8 and 10 in human years, left largely unsupervised between training sessions. They had instructors, sure, brutal, efficient warriors who taught them combat tactics and survival skills. But nobody was teaching them anything else. Nobody was making sure they ate properly, slept enough, or developed any kind of emotional regulation. Holly had found Lith on her 3rd day, hiding in a maintenance closet, scales dull with stress, having not eaten in 2 days because he'd failed a training exercise and decided he didn't deserve food. That had been it. Holly might have been just a contractor, just a human in way over her head. But she'd grown up with 3 younger brothers and a mother who'd taught her that taking care of others wasn't optional. It was basic decency. So she'd started showing up at mealtimes, started implementing routines, started treating these terrifying predator cubs like what they actually were, kids. The Karath officers had been baffled, but hadn't stopped her, probably because the cubs' performance metrics had actually improved over the past 18 days. Turned out that beings who felt safe and cared for learned more effectively than beings who were constantly stressed and competing for resources. Revolutionary concept, apparently. Holly, Kef said suddenly, her voice dropping to that particular register that meant she was about to ask a serious question. "Why do you do this?" "Do what?" "This." Kef gestured with one clawed hand at the table, the plates, the whole setup. "You're not military. You're not even Karath. You have no obligation to us." Holly set down her fork, considering the question. The cubs were all watching her now, even Hux pausing mid-bite. "Because you're kids," she said finally. "And kids need someone to care about them. Doesn't matter what species. Doesn't matter what your future career is going to be. Everyone deserves to have someone who makes sure they're okay." "We're warriors," Drell said, but there was uncertainty in his voice. "You're warriors in training," Holly corrected. "Right now, you're cubs. And cubs need dinner, and bedtime routines, and someone to tell them that throwing furniture isn't an appropriate response to frustration." Pix had the grace to look embarrassed at that last part. The chair incident had been memorable. "Besides," Holly continued, her tone lightening, "someone has to make sure you lot don't eat nothing but meat and turn into the galaxy's most intimidating vitamin-deficient warriors. Where's the glory in conquering star systems if you've got scurvy?" That got a laugh. Actual laughs, not growls. Holly counted it as a win. She was just standing to clear the plates when every light in the facility turned red. The emergency klaxons started their ear-splitting wail. The heavy blast doors at both ends of the dining hall slammed shut, with a hydraulic hiss that promised nothing good. And the calm, automated voice of the facility's AI announced, "Lockdown protocol initiated. All personnel report to defensive positions. This is not a drill." The cubs were on their feet instantly, all play forgotten, every muscle tensed for action. Thousands of generations of predatory instinct activated in a heartbeat. Holly's heart rate kicked up, adrenaline flooding her system, but she kept her voice level. "Okay. Deep breaths, everyone. Let's not panic." "Lockdown means hostile intrusion," Tor said, his voice sharp. "We're under attack." "Maybe. Or it could be a false alarm. System glitch." Holly moved toward the comm panel on the wall, trying to project calm she didn't entirely feel. "Let me check with—" The panel was dead. Not just offline, completely dead. The screen cracked like something had hit it from the other side of the wall. That was less reassuring. "All right," Holly said, turning back to the cubs. "New plan. We stay here, we stay quiet, and we wait for the all-clear. This room is secure. Those blast doors are rated for capital ship weapons. We're safe." "We should be fighting," Pix said, her scales beginning to glow brighter with agitation. "We're trained for this. You're trained for practice scenarios. This is different." Holly moved back to the table, positioning herself where she could see all 6 cubs. "Look, I know every instinct you have is telling you to go hunting for threats. But the smart thing, the strategic thing, is to stay in a defensible position and not run blindly into danger." Hux growled low in his chest. "You think we're cowards. I think you're smart enough to know the difference between bravery and stupidity." Holly met his gaze steadily. She'd learned early that backing down from a Karath, even a juvenile one, was a mistake. "And I think you're disciplined enough to follow protocol." It was a gamble, appealing to their training rather than trying to mother them. But it worked. Hux settled slightly, still tense, but no longer looking ready to throw himself at the blast doors. "Besides," Holly added, injecting some lightness into her tone, "we haven't had dessert yet. And I went through a lot of trouble to get those frozen treats past customs. Would be a shame to waste them because we all got vaporized running toward explosions." Kef actually snorted at that. "Your species is insane." "Probably. But we're insane in a fun way." Holly glanced at the blast doors, then back at the cubs. "Come on, sit down. If something's actually wrong, security will handle it. That's their job. Our job is to finish dinner and not do anything stupid." The cubs, slowly and with obvious reluctance, returned to their seats. Holly had no idea that at that exact moment, 12 of the most dangerous assassins in known space were cutting through the facility's outer defenses like they were made of tissue paper. She had no idea that Admiral Ukthen of the Ixcar Dominion had sent his elite death squad, the infamous Bone Collectors, with one mission: eliminate the next generation of Karath warriors before they could mature into the unstoppable force their species was known for. She had no idea that in approximately 8 minutes, those 12 assassins would breach the dining hall. What she did know was that Hux was eyeing the dessert freezer with intense focus. Lith was stress-grooming his scales, and Drell had started that low humming sound he made when he was trying not to panic. So Holly did what she always did. She pulled out a deck of cards from her pocket, human playing cards, worn soft from use, and dealt out hands for a game she'd been teaching them called Go Fish. "All right," she said, settling into her chair like the facility wasn't on high alert. "Who's ready to lose again?" The cubs, despite themselves, leaned in, and that was how the most dangerous tactical miscalculation in galactic military history began. With a human playing card games while an elite death squad closed in, completely unaware that they were about to encounter something far more terrifying than warriors. They were about to encounter children with a protector. The Bone Collectors had a reputation that made hardened warlords reconsider their life choices. 12 operatives, each a master of their craft, each responsible for more high-profile eliminations than most people had hot meals. They moved through the facility's corridors like smoke, silent and deadly, their adaptive camouflage rendering them nearly invisible against the metal walls. Kalmix, leading the squad, checked his tactical display. All security personnel were converging on a false breach point his team had created on the east side of the compound. Beautiful misdirection. The real target, the dining hall where intelligence reported the cubs spent their evenings, was wide open. He signaled his team forward with a gesture that had preceded the death of presidents, generals, and at least one planetary governor. The blast doors ahead were sealed, but their infiltration tech made short work of military-grade locks. The heavy metal groaned and began to slide open. Inside the dining hall, Holly looked up from her cards. "Hux, do you have any threes?" "Go fish," Hux rumbled, then paused. His head swiveled toward the blast door that was, against all logic and safety protocols, opening. "Holly, the door." "Yeah, I see it." Holly set down her cards slowly, her mind racing. The doors shouldn't open during lockdown, which meant either the lockdown was over, unlikely given the klaxons were still wailing, or someone had overridden the security system. Neither option was great. The door finished opening. 12 figures in tactical gear materialized from literally nowhere, their camouflage systems deactivating as they entered the room. They were armed with enough firepower to level a small building. Each weapon was pointed with professional precision at different targets throughout the room. Holly's brain, in that peculiar way human brains work under stress, registered several things simultaneously. These were not friendly forces. Those weapons were very real, and she had 6 kids to protect. Her mouth, however, went in a completely different direction. "Oh, thank God," she said, standing up and brushing off her pants. "I tried the comm panel, but it's completely fried. Are you here about the lockdown? Because honestly, the alert system in this place is a nightmare. Half the time it goes off because someone microwaved fish in the break room." Kalmix, who had breached fortified positions on 8 different worlds, who had stared down enemy combatants without flinching, who had been trained to expect every possible scenario, had not been trained for this. The human was walking toward him, just walking over, like he and his team were maintenance workers instead of elite assassins. "You guys need to talk to whoever designed this facility," Holly continued, apparently oblivious to the fact that 12 weapons were tracking her movement. "The environmental systems are held together with duct tape and prayer. The comm network drops every time there's a solar flare, and don't even get me started on the plumbing in Sector 4. Behind her, the cubs had gone absolutely still. Not the stillness of fear, the stillness of predators who'd spotted something wrong but weren't sure yet what to do about it. Their eyes tracked the armed figures with the kind of focus that preceded violence. But Holly had told them to stay seated. And Holly's instructions over the past 18 days had become something close to law in their small pack hierarchy. Kalmix found his voice. "You need to move away from the cubs." "The cubs?" Holly glanced back at the table. "Oh, they're fine. We're just finishing dinner." "Well, technically we're playing cards, but same difference." She paused, really looking at the tactical gear, the weapons, the general aura of lethal intent. "Wait, are you guys the new security rotation? Because nobody told me there was a shift change scheduled." One of the assassins, a Ixkar female named Threshik, whispered into the comm channel that only the team could hear. "Is she serious?" "I don't know," Kalmix admitted on the same channel. Holly was still talking. "Look, if you're here to inspect the facility, I've got documentation on all the environmental systems. Fair warning, though, the temperature regulation in the South Wing is currently held together with what I'm pretty sure is war crime-adjacent engineering. But it works, so please don't report it." Tor, still seated at the table, tilted his head slightly. His translator was working fine. These were not Kavrath, not security. And they smelled wrong. The particular scent that came with adrenaline and hostile intent. But Holly wasn't reacting like they were threats, which meant either Holly was an idiot, unlikely, given she'd been outthinking them for 18 days straight, or Holly didn't understand the situation. "We are not security," Kalmix said slowly, his weapon still trained on the human. "We are here for the cubs." "Oh." Holly's expression shifted to something like understanding. "You're from the training division? Look, I know their test scores have been a little inconsistent, but that's actually normal for this developmental stage. Their retention is excellent when they're not overstressed, and honestly, the previous training protocols were probably doing more harm than—" "We are not trainers." Kalmix was beginning to feel something he hadn't experienced in his entire career. Complete bewilderment. "We are here to eliminate the cubs." There was a beat of absolute silence. Holly blinked. "I'm sorry, what?" "To eliminate them. Kill them. Remove the next generation of Karath warriors before they become operational." Kalmix heard himself explaining his mission, like he was discussing a maintenance schedule, and wondered if this human had somehow weaponized confusion. Holly's expression went through several rapid changes. Confusion, disbelief, comprehension, and then something that made even trained assassins take an unconscious step back. Absolute fury. "You want to kill children." Her voice had gone very, very quiet. "You brought guns into this room to shoot kids." "They are enemy combatants," Kalmix said. But even as he said it, he was looking at the scene he'd just walked into. Cubs sitting at a table, playing cards. Half-eaten dinner on plates with little placemats underneath. It looked nothing like a military target. "They are 8, Holly said, each word sharp enough to cut. "They are children eating dinner, and you brought a death squad to murder them." Behind her, Hux rose from his seat. not in a crouch, not in an attack posture. Just stood up, his full height suddenly very apparent. His scales had darkened, the bioluminescent markings pulsing in a pattern that Colmix's threat analysis software flagged as pre-combat aggression. "Holly," Huck said quietly, "permission to engage." "No." Holly didn't take her eyes off Colmix. "We don't engage. We use our words first." "These people want to kill us," Pix added, also standing. Her claws had extended, each one capable of shearing through armor, plating. "And that's bad behavior that we're going to address." Holly's voice was still terrifyingly calm. "But we're not going to sink to their level. Are we?" The cubs, incredibly, held position. Every instinct they had must have been screaming at them to attack, to defend, to eliminate the threat. But they'd spent 18 days learning to trust this human's judgment, even when that judgment seemed completely insane. Colmix gestured to his team. 3 of them moved to flank the cubs, weapons raised. This was getting out of hand. They had a mission. Sentiment didn't factor into it. "Ma'am, you need to step aside." "No. This is not a negotiation." "You're right. It's not." Holly crossed her arms. "Because I'm not moving, and you're not shooting anyone. You know why?" "Why?" Colmix asked, against his better judgment. "Because shooting children is wrong." Holly said it like she was explaining basic arithmetic. "Like, fundamentally wrong. I don't care what species they are. I don't care what they might grow up to be. Right now, they're kids, and you don't kill kids." Lith, the smallest cub, had been silent through all of this. But now he spoke, his voice thin with something that might have been fear. "Holly, you should move. We can fight. You'll get hurt." "Lith, honey, I appreciate the concern, but I'm not going anywhere." Holly glanced back at him, and her expression softened just slightly. "Remember what we talked about? About how sometimes adults need to do hard things to protect the people they care about?" "This is stupid," Drell muttered, but he hadn't moved either. "You're one human. They have 12 soldiers, and enough firepower to level this room." "Yeah, well, I've got 6 of the toughest kids in the galaxy behind me, so I'd say we're about even." Holly turned back to the assassins. "Last chance, gentlemen. Put down the weapons, walk away, and we'll pretend this never happened." Colmix had killed people for far less provocation. He'd eliminated targets who begged, who fought, who tried to bargain. He'd done his job with cold efficiency for more years than he cared to count. But this human wasn't begging or fighting or bargaining. She was just standing there, between his team and their targets. Like her presence alone was supposed to matter. The really disturbing part was that it kind of did. "Final warning," he said, raising his weapon to point directly at her. "Move, or we move you." Holly didn't budge. "You're going to have to shoot through me." Behind her, something shifted in the cubs. They'd been holding still, holding back, because Holly had told them to. But hearing someone threaten to shoot her changed the equation entirely. Hux's growl started low in his chest, building to something that made the metal floor vibrate. Pix's claws scraped against the floor, leaving gouges in the reinforced material. Tor's eyes had gone completely black, the Karath equivalent of combat mode engaging. Even Lith, small and still learning, had his teeth bared in a way that promised violence. Kef and Drell moved to flank their siblings, forming a loose semicircle behind Holly. Not attacking. Not yet. But ready. "Holly," Kef said softly, "if they hurt you, we can't be responsible for what happens next." "Nobody's hurting anybody," Holly insisted, though her voice had picked up a slight tremor. Fear, maybe, or adrenaline. We're all going to stay calm and— Threshik, the assassin who'd been silent until now, made a decision. She swung her weapon toward Lith, the smallest target, figuring that eliminating one cub would break whatever strange spell this human had cast. She didn't pull the trigger. Didn't get the chance. Pix moved. Not with military precision. Not with trained combat tactics. She moved like a kid who'd just seen someone threaten her clutchmate, with all the wild fury that implied. She was across the room in 2 bounds, a red blur of scales and rage. Her shoulder hit Threshik's center mass with enough force to send the assassin flying into the wall. The weapon clattered away, and Pix was on her, not biting, not killing, just pinning her down with one clawed hand while making a sound that was part growl, part shriek. "Bad!" Pix shouted, the translator rendering her karath as something close to a child's tantrum. "You don't point guns at Lith!" The room exploded into chaos. Not coordinated chaos, not tactical chaos, just chaos. Hux launched himself at the nearest assassin, tackling him not with a warrior's precision, but with the enthusiastic clumsiness of someone who'd spent more time learning about personal boundaries than hand-to-hand combat. They went down in a tangle of limbs and scales, the assassin trying desperately to get his weapon up while Hux sat on him. Tor, demonstrating slightly more tactical thinking, grabbed the edge of the table and flipped it toward 2 more assassins. Plates, cards, and synth meat went flying. One assassin dodged, the other took a placemat to the face, which shouldn't have been effective, but somehow managed to be distracting enough that Kef could swipe his weapon away with one well-placed claw. Drell discovered that the chairs, the nice chairs Holly had brought in, were surprisingly aerodynamic when thrown. And Lith, the smallest and usually the gentlest, bit someone's ankle. Not a killing bite. More of an "I learned about self-defense and I'm going to use it" bite. But the assassin in question yelped and stumbled, which gave Holly enough time to grab a serving tray and brain him with it. "Inside voices!" Holly was shouting over the chaos, which was possibly the most ridiculous thing to say during a combat situation, but somehow felt appropriate. "We use inside voices." Kalmix tried to get a clear shot. Any clear shot. But the cubs were moving too fast, too erratically, and the human kept getting in the way. And this was not how any mission brief had ever described combat with Karath warriors. One of his operatives went down when Tor sat on him. Just sat on him. The weight of a juvenile Karath was apparently enough to pin a fully grown Ixkar to the floor. Another operative was dealing with Kef, who discovered that the disabling enemy weapons tactic they'd been taught worked even better when you added the element of surprise and a complete disregard for personal safety. A third was trying to fend off Drell, who'd run out of chairs to throw and had moved on to throwing plates, cups, and what appeared to be a potted plant. "This is insane!" Threshik gasped from underneath Pix, who still had her pinned. "You're not even fighting properly." "We're fighting fine," Pix snapped back. "Holly says fighting isn't about rules, it's about protecting your pack." "I did not say that," Holly interjected, ducking under a wild plasma bolt that scorched the ceiling. "I said conflict resolution is about communication." "Same thing!" It really wasn't, but Holly didn't have time to argue the point because Kalmix was advancing on her, and while she'd been brave, or possibly stupid, enough to stand between him and the cubs before, she wasn't actually trained in combat. She did, however, have excellent reflexes and zero hesitation. When he raised his weapon, she grabbed the nearest object, which happened to be the dessert cart she'd been wheeling over earlier, and shoved it at him with all her strength. The cart hit his knees. He stumbled, and approximately 3 gallons of frozen synthetic dessert products cascaded onto him, covering his armor in strawberry, chocolate, and vanilla swirl. For a moment, everyone stopped. The room went quiet except for the sound of dripping ice cream and heavy breathing. Colmix looked down at himself, looked up at Holly, looked at his team, half of whom were pinned, disarmed, or otherwise incapacitated by cubs who were fighting with more enthusiasm than skill. Holly, covered in dessert splatter herself, pointed one finger at him. "You destroyed dessert." What? You destroyed dessert." Holly's voice was shaking now. Whether with fear or fury or adrenaline was impossible to tell. "We were going to have dessert after dinner, because that's what you do. And you came in here with your guns and your death squad nonsense, and you ruined it." Behind her, Hux made a sound that might have been agreement. Pix, still sitting on Threshik, looked at the destroyed dessert with genuine dismay. "We were going to have frozen treats." "We worked really hard today," Lith added softly, his voice plaintive. "We did all our exercises. We earned dessert. And these absolute jerks," Holly gestured wildly at the bone collectors, "decided that murdering children was more important than basic decency and appropriate mealtime protocols." Colmix had trained for this mission for 6 weeks. He'd studied Karath combat tactics, reviewed facility layouts, memorized guard rotations. He'd prepared for every possible contingency. Except this one. He was covered in ice cream. Half his team was pinned down by cubs who fought like they'd learned combat from a deranged kindergarten teacher. And the human he'd been sent to move out of the way was somehow winning an argument about dessert. "You're insane," he said finally. "No," Holly corrected, wiping strawberry swirl off her cheek. "I'm hungry, I'm angry, and I'm trying very hard not to let these kids see me lose my temper. Because we're working on emotional regulation, and I try to model appropriate behavior." "By throwing dessert at armed hostiles? By standing up to bullies who pick on children?" Holly took a step closer, and despite every tactical bone in his body screaming that she was unarmed and untrained and not a threat, Colmix took a step back. "Now, here's what's going to happen. You and your little murder squad are going to leave. Right now. And you're going to tell whoever sent you that the cubs are under protection. And if anyone tries this again, they're going to deal with me. You can't protect them forever. Watch me." And the terrifying thing was, Colmix believed her. Colmix was about to respond, probably something tactical and threatening, when Holly held up one finger in the universal gesture for "wait a moment," and turned toward the kitchen area. "I'm getting the backup dessert," she announced, like the room wasn't full of armed combatants and chaos. "Because we're going to finish this meal properly if it kills me." "It might," Colmix muttered, but she was already walking away. The remaining mobile assassins exchanged glances. This was their window. Target was distracted. Cubs were scattered. They could still complete the mission. But something felt wrong. Fundamentally wrong. They were elite operatives, and their instincts, the ones that had kept them alive through countless operations, were screaming warnings. Holly emerged from the kitchen carrying a metal container of frozen treats, humming something that sounded cheerful and deeply inappropriate for a combat situation. That was when one of Colmix's operatives, a hothead named Drix, who'd always been too eager, made a choice. He raised his weapon, pointed it at the smallest target he could see. Lith. Holly saw it, saw the weapon tracking, saw the finger on the trigger. "No!" She threw the dessert container. It was not a good throw. Humans weren't built for accuracy under pressure. The container tumbled through the air in a wild arc, frozen treats spilling out like sugary ammunition. Drix fired, missed Lith by inches because the cub had ducked, hit the dessert container mid-flight. The explosion of frozen synthetic compounds was surprisingly dramatic. Chunks of ice cream became shrapnel. Strawberry sauce splattered across 3 assassins. A whole frozen cake, Holly had been saving it for something special, disintegrated into a cloud of cream and crumbs. Holly stood there, covered head to toe in dessert debris, dripping with melted ice cream, absolutely vibrating with rage. That, she said quietly, dangerously, was for their graduation. The cubs stared at the destroyed dessert, at Holly, covered in the ruins of something she'd clearly worked hard to acquire, at the assassins responsible. Something shifted. They'd been fighting because Holly was threatened. They'd been holding back because Holly had taught them restraint. They'd been trying to be good, to be civilized, to use appropriate conflict resolution. But these people had destroyed dessert. Dessert that Holly had gotten for them. Dessert they'd earned. Dessert that represented one of the few good things in their brutal training schedule. Hux moved first. Not with a cub's enthusiasm this time. With purpose. With the cold calculation that his species was famous for. He grabbed the nearest assassin by the armor and physically threw him across the room into a wall. The impact left a dent. Pix stopped playing with Threshik, started actually fighting. Her claws found armor seams with surgical precision, not killing, but absolutely disabling. Tor and Kef worked together, flanking targets with the coordination that their training had been trying to teach them for months, and that had finally clicked. Drell discovered that jump ropes, Holly had brought jump ropes for their conditioning training, made excellent restraints when you had the strength to hog-tie a full-grown soldier. Even Lith, small and gentle Lith, launched himself at Drix with a snarl that promised retribution for ruining dessert. Holly tried to maintain some semblance of control. "Use your words. Count to 10. Someone count to 10. Nobody was counting to 10. The bone collectors were legendary. They'd toppled governments. They'd eliminated targets that were supposedly untouchable. But they'd never fought opponents who were motivated by pure dessert-fueled rage and 18 days of learning that working together for someone you cared about was more effective than individual glory. Within minutes, all 12 assassins were subdued. Not dead. Holly had apparently taught the cubs about proportional response, but very, very defeated. The facility security forces finally arrived, 20 minutes late, looking sheepish and heavily armed, to find a scene that would require 3 separate incident reports and at least 1 psychological evaluation. 12 elite assassins tied up with jump ropes and what appeared to be extension cords. 6 predator cubs sitting in a semicircle, panting but uninjured, and 1 human woman covered head to toe in melted ice cream, reading them a lecture about appropriate force escalation. "And that," Holly was saying, pointing at Hux, "is why we don't throw people into walls unless absolutely necessary. What if you'd hit a support beam? What if you'd caused a hull breach? We've talked about thinking through consequences." Hux, who had just single-handedly subdued 3 trained killers, looked genuinely chastened. "Sorry, Holly." "I know you're sorry, but sorry doesn't fix walls." She turned to the security chief, who was staring at the scene with his mouth open. "Oh, good. You're here. These individuals attempted to harm the cubs. I've restrained them for processing. Also, your response time is terrible, and we need to discuss facility security protocols." The security chief blinked. "You restrained them?" "Well, mostly the cubs did the restraining. I supervised." Holly gestured at the bound assassins. They destroyed dessert. It was a whole thing. Can someone get maintenance down here? The blast door mechanism is fried, and there's ice cream in the ventilation system. In orbit above the planet, Admiral Ukthen watched the security feeds with growing horror. His elite death squad, had been neutralized by cubs and a human who appeared to be more concerned about dessert than deadly combat. He gave the order to retreat immediately. Whatever nightmare experiment the Karath were running in that facility, he wanted no part of it. The footage went up the chain of command at speeds that violated several communication protocols. By morning, every Karath military leader had watched it. Multiple times. General Korth, head of the warrior training program, sat in stunned silence as he reviewed the security recordings. He'd spent 30 cycles developing combat protocols, designing the perfect training regimen to create unstoppable warriors. And a human contractor, with no military background, had accidentally done better in 18 days. "Replay the section where the small one bites the assassin," he ordered. His aide complied. They watched Lith, who'd been flagged as potentially too weak for the program, defend himself with zero hesitation because someone he cared about was threatened. And the part where they work together. The footage showed Tor and Kef moving in perfect synchronization, not because they'd drilled the maneuver, but because they'd learned to trust each other over card games and shared meals. "What exactly has this human been doing?" Korth asked. His aide pulled up Holly's activity logs, teaching them proper nutrition, emotional regulation, conflict resolution, and something called family dinner dynamics. "That's it? And making them eat vegetables, sir." Korth watched the footage again. Watched cubs who'd been struggling in standard training suddenly demonstrate tactical brilliance, unit cohesion, and fighting spirit that the Academy's brutal methods had never managed to instill. All because someone had shown them basic care and decency. "Get me a meeting with this human," he said finally, "and someone find out where she learned this training methodology." 3 days later, Holly was called into what she assumed was a meeting about her destroyed kitchen and the incident reports. Instead, she found herself facing the entire Karath military command structure. "We want to expand your role," General Korth said without preamble. Holly, still not entirely sure she wasn't in trouble, blinked. "Expand it how?" "You will oversee cub development protocols across all training facilities. Full authority. Whatever resources you need." "I'm not a soldier. I'm an environmental technician who accidentally started feeding your kids." "Yes. And in 18 days, you created the most effective combat unit we've seen in generations." Korth leaned forward. "How?" Holly thought about it. About Hux learning to control his food aggression. About Pix channeling her energy productively. About Lith discovering that being small didn't mean being weak. About all of them learning that protecting each other was more powerful than individual glory. "I just treated them like people," she said finally. "Like kids who needed someone to care about them. That's it. That's the whole secret." The generals exchanged glances that suggested this was somehow revolutionary information. "We'll triple your salary," Korth offered. "I want a better kitchen, and a proper budget for nutrition, and mental health resources." Holly crossed her arms. "And someone needs to fix the plumbing in Sector 4. Done. Within a month, every Karath military facility had implemented what became known as the Attachment Protocol. Cubs were assigned care supervisors. Communal meals became mandatory. Emotional regulation training was added to combat curricula. The Ixkar Dominion sent 3 more assassination attempts over the next cycle. All 3 retreated without engaging when they discovered humans reading bedtime stories to cubs. Turned out the galaxy's most effective defense system wasn't shields or weapons or tactical superiority. It was someone who gave a damn. Holly never did get her graduation cake replaced, but watching Lith confidently lead his first training exercise, watching Pix channel her energy into mentoring newer cubs, watching Hux share his food without being asked, that was better than any dessert. Though she did eventually get the plumbing fixed in Sector 4. Small victories,